Welcome to the Koso Konnections podcast, where the ancient art of Japanese fermentation science meets modern natural health. Embark with us on a journey of transformation, exploring age-old wellness practices through inspiring discussions, expert advice, and personal stories shared by experts and our customers. Discover how these traditions can revolutionize your health and well-being today.
Welcome back to Koso Konnections. I'm Lei, and I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, nutrition expert Ella Davar. Hey, Ella.
Hi, Lei, and hello to all of our listeners. We've got some exciting episode for you today.
We truly do. Today, we're diving into the world of organic JAS farming in Japan. What makes it so special and why it's considered the highest quality in the world.
And to help us unpack this fascinating topic, we have a regular guest, the informative Dr. Z. Welcome back, Dr. Z. It's such a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Lei. Thank you, Ella. It's great to be here again. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Yeah, hi, Doc. So to get this podcast started, everyone, you might be wondering, what is JAS or JAS? Let's start with the basics. Dr. Z, can you explain what JAS farming is?
Sure, it'd be my pleasure. JAS stands for Japanese Agriculture Standards. It's a guideline that is set by the Japanese government to ensure safety and quality of the agricultural products. Organic JAS certification is extremely difficult to get, and it covers everything from the quality of the produce to the soil quality, to the use of natural pesticides, to the processing, to the packaging of the products, and more important, to the safety of the consumer.
So it's more of a holistic approach to farming, right? It's not just avoiding synthetic chemicals. Can you tell us more?
Well, JAS farming encompasses more of an ecosystem of farming. I'll try to explain it in a way that most people will probably understand. In the industrial countries, United States including, we have switched from what we call localized farming to commercialized farming. What that means is we've gone from taking care of a very small amount of crops to now taking care of vast amount of crops. That would be very similar to if I said to either one of you, could you babysit my kids for the night? You probably would say, yeah, that's great. And you'd probably be able to take really good care of the kids and show them love and have fun. However, if I turned that around and said, I've got 1,000 kids for you to babysit, then you would lose control of the whole situation. You would not be able to give them the love and the care and the consideration. And commercial farming, especially in the industrial countries, has become like that. We are losing control of the quality of the product. Therefore, by trying to take care of the crops, we're using helicopters and drones and all of the things that really don't really help the quality. And in fact, we have to use a tremendous amount of chemicals in order to keep the control of those crops. That is a really huge difference and pretty much sets Japan JAS standards apart from the rest of the world.
So without the pesticides and the preservatives, how do you keep the crops healthy?
Well, in Japan especially, one of the things that impressed me the most, and I've traveled all throughout the world, I think that the fundamental difference between Japanese farming and other farmers that I've seen around the world is the word love. When you're taking care of something and you're really putting your passion into it, and that applies to all parts of life, you tend to want your produce or your end product to be better than other products in the marketplace. And I think the Japanese farmers tend to put a tremendous amount of love into what they do. And I say that in a very nice way. They take a 3-step approach. The first step is obviously looking at the soil and the conditions of the soils. A lot of farmers don't have the time to look at the soils because they have to go into what we call a speed mode. They have to make the crops move very, very quickly. The second part of it is the actual care, what I just mentioned before. Being able to take care of your baby, so to speak, in smaller parcels. I don't know if many have traveled through the state of Idaho or Utah. You see vast amounts of corn and potatoes. You can get lost in those crops. You have no idea where you are. In Japan, everybody has a very small parcel of land. They walk into their parcel, they look around, they can see their crops, they can see whether one is doing better than the other, they can clean, they have a much better control. It's a fundamental difference. And I think that the world itself has pretty much switched from what I call parcel farming into colonized farming. And colonized farming is very difficult to control, almost impossible.
Yeah, well, it does sound like a lot of effort. So you're saying, Doc, that the farmers, they don't really spray anything, no pesticides and preservatives, because of course it's still soil and there's going to be pests and like plant diseases, right?
Yes, but Japan government is quite strict about how to handle your crops. They set a standard in place and they do, weekly, monthly, and yearly inspections. And it's very difficult for farmers to get away with overspraying or in some cases using chemicals to promote their products because you've got somebody that's monitoring you. It's very different than other countries. Other countries, there's not really enough monitoring that takes place. And again, if you go back to what I just said about commercialized farming or colonized farming, it's almost impossible to manage something that has thousands and thousands and thousands of hectares and acres. You're basically dependent on technology and you lose the human element. Japan is an older traditional country and they tend to look at things from a different perspective. And there is a lot of new technology that helps as far as, GPS and weather patterns and things like that. But the tradition of going out and just monitoring your crops, looking at your crops, feeling your crops, touching your crops is something that's really lost in the commercialized areas, especially in countries like the United States. If you go out to vast areas of Texas, there's no monitoring. It's just grow it fast. And you can see it in the supermarkets. You can see these huge onions. By nature, they're not designed to be that big.
Well, now that we've covered the broad subject, Dr. Z, could you please tell us a little bit more specifically to Koso Med Farm? Because I have yet to visit it one day, and I would love to hear from your own personal and professional experience of what Koso Med Farm looks like and what some of the practices and values that they establish there.
Well, it's a really great question. And also, Ella, I do think you'll be coming to Japan here shortly. We'll be having a tour here in the next fall. Yeah, and you'll be able to see all of this firsthand. And I think a lot of what I just mentioned will come to be when you see the farmers out there at 3 o'clock in the morning, wrapping the vegetables, making sure that they're warm. They treat it like children. But in specific, to answer your question, Koso Med has developed a process because of the products that we make. Our main goal is to keep the product as fresh as possible and to keep the enzymatic levels of the products as fresh as possible. In order to do that, harvest has to be very narrow. And so around our factory, we developed all of our farms. So within a 10 to 20 minute drive from the farm to the factory, that enables us to keep the product as fresh and preserved with our fermentation as fresh as possible. But the farms themselves are another standard. We go well beyond JAS, Japan Agriculture Standard. We developed a system to where every farmer has to dedicate himself to the quality. So in other words, when they deliver the products to the factory, they have to sign off. It's almost like signing a check of some kind. If there's any kind of irregularity, if there's any kind of chemical inconsistency, they are responsible for it. So we kind of manage everything in a structure to where everybody has a responsibility. As far as the farms are concerned, I feel it's the best that I've ever seen around the world. And seeing is believing. And again, it goes back to what I just mentioned before. The love that our farmers give the farm is exceptional. I mean, they get up early in the morning. They stay with it like a baby. And that has been the blessing that we received. And again, this is a cultural difference between, I think, Japan and most countries. Japanese farmers tend to be generational farmers. That means that their great grandfather was a farmer, and so on and so on and so on. Now it's their grandson, and so on and so on. And so the tradition of passing that technology to their children is quite exceptional. So I think culturally, there's a big difference between the way a person would adapt to their farm in Japan and a person that just became a farmer for the commercial value.
Well, thank you for covering that, Dr. Z. Next time you're on the farm out there, please take some pictures and some videos for our listeners to tune in and to see what it's really like out there. It sounds incredible.
Yeah, well, we do have a lot of pictures in the library, and we can share that with our listeners anytime. It's really, but seeing is believing. And I've had a number of people who come out to the farms and they go, "Oh my God, this is not organic." And I say, "Why?" They say, "There's grass, there's birds, there's insects." And I say, "That's the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to have insects. If you don't see insects and if you don't see birds, by all means, it's not organic." Birds and animals are very, exactly, they're very sensitive, very sensitive.
Well, wow, that's incredible. And I hope other countries adopt that as well. It seems really good for everyone and the produce itself. And so now, speaking of the produce, let's talk about the benefits. Why is organic JAS farming considered superior?
Well, I mean, if you're drinking or eating any kind of food, you obviously want food that is free of chemicals. And chemicals are probably the biggest issue that our world is facing today. We have a lot of talk about sustainability and warming of the climate, but food is an issue that a lot of people have not really addressed. I address it a lot in our company, and obviously when we talk to the farmers, because safety is our main priority. You're going to spend your entire lifetime eating produce, probably the size of an Olympic swimming pool. If you're eating basically undigestible foods full of toxins and poisons and chemicals, and I can give you the list anywhere from Roundup, and I don't want to mention all the different products because there's many of them out in the marketplace. The old saying, "You are what you eat," is basically true. With JAS, we've eliminated 99.9% of that issue. We don't have to deal with those chemicals and the preservatives and all the other things that these days other farmers do, like painting of the vegetables. A lot of people don't know that a lot of lemons and oranges are not really yellow and orange. As a consumer, you want an orange that looks orange. So guess what the farmers do? They paint it orange. It is the hidden agenda behind most of the farming in the industry. The consumer dictates what is going to be on your dinner plate. And so if you want to have something that looks good, you'll have to paint it up.
Well, let's talk about the nutritional density of the Japanese agricultural standard certified products, because from our listeners' perspective, we are concerned with not just the taste, but the nutritional density. And it sounds like, from my understanding, that the nutrient density is also superior. Am I right?
Absolutely, Ella. There's a few elements that are really quite important to growing any kind of crop. I think the first element is going to be the soil. And in JAS processes and Koso Med's processes, soils are intensely tested for mercury, for arsenic. And it's quite surprising to me to see crops that are grown around the world, and they're grown in soils that were used to grow tobacco, for example. Tobacco, one of the chemicals that's used to grow tobacco would be arsenic. Though it would be low levels of arsenic, it could be quite dangerous as the crop matures. The other element that makes a really great crop here in Japan is the time. You need to give the crop enough time to absorb the nutrients from the ground, to be able to absorb the minerals from the water, to absorb the sunshine. And there's a period of time that it would take. For example, one of the plants that we grow is aloe vera. It takes 5 to 6 years to mature. Aloe vera grown in other countries are grown in 4 to 6 weeks. there's a huge difference in the absorption rate and the nutritious value of that particular product. And that would be applicable to almost anything. We are in such a hurry these days to grow things. And you can see that in the marketplace. Things get really huge. They get bigger and bigger and bigger, up to a point where even a cucumber looks like, it's a baseball bat. So sometimes, as my own farming experience, when I go to the shops, I look around and I can see that you're basically buying water. There's no nutrition, there's no vitamins in the product. And the third thing I think that is really quite important is the harvesting time. A lot of things are harvested very early because, we got to get it out into the marketplace. And when you harvest things early, guess what happens? They don't reach their nutritional value. And we've all been in that position when you go to the stores in the industrial countries and in the United States, where you bite into what looks to be a very beautiful fruit, yet there's no taste. It just tastes bland. And this is a good example of something that is grown very fast. I've used the Japanese Fuji apple in my demonstrations for the last 2 decades. And I can tell you, when you bite into a mature Fuji apple, it's like eating honey. And that's the way it's supposed to be grown. And it could take much, much longer to harvest. And again, the farmer will cover it and he will protect it and he will baby it. And he will make sure that it is, part of its family. So that makes a big difference in something that's just grown for speed. It's almost like going down the highway at 140 miles an hour. You get there faster, but it's dangerous. And, in our case, we take a lot of time, and sometimes even longer than most people would expect. 5 years is a long time to wait for a plant to mature. And the people that have been to our farms, they'll go, "How old is this plant?" And I'll go, "It's 15 years old." 15 years old. I said, "Yes, it's 15 years old." But the nutritious value of that particular plant is much, much superior than something that's grown for 30 days.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to explain that. That is uniquely valuable, and I could definitely relate to that. Being in America for 20 years, not only we're here quick to grow things, when you mentioned it, we're also quick to consume things, and everything that you just laid out just makes sense.
Yeah, unfortunately, this speed is rapidly increasing. It's not slowing. And the farming industry now is changed in such a way that the pressure on a commercial farmer, especially in the United States, is tremendous. To have to output, to have to create something in a very short period of time, and to be profitable is quite a challenge for them. I appreciate our farmers a lot because they do take a painful amount of time to create something. It's almost like art to a certain degree. They're taking their own precious time, if you want to qualify that as value equals salary, and they put the salary to the side. And so, again, that goes back to the traditional methods here in Japan. And Japan is very unique in its manufacturing facilities and the way that people perform. They almost go back in time and kind of avoid the future. They kind of like to do things slowly and make sure that it's perfected. And, Ella, I mean, not only in the United States, but even in other European countries, I mean, things are grown so fast. And I'm not talking about your local farmers. That sometimes when it comes to the marketplace, you look at it and go, "What is that?" It's not easy to tell what it is. So, and that doesn't just apply to fruits and vegetables. It also applies to our animals, our poultry. We're growing chickens in 2 months. We used to grow chickens in 3 years. We're growing pigs in 6 weeks. It used to take 2 years, and so forth. And the salmon, and it goes on. The list goes on and on and on and on. So the rapid pace, something is lost.
If I were to summarize this episode for our listeners, from what I gathered from what you're saying is that the Japanese agricultural standards differs from the others in their uncompromised values and commitment to high quality produce, despite the pressures of the time, profits, and the outcomes, and that they take their time to continue staying committed to making the most highest quality and the way it is designed by nature.
Yes, and that's the way the farming industry was formulated here in Japan. Most of the other countries, their farming depends on subsidies from government. And other sources of income so that their main goal is to reach a quota. Here in Japan, we don't have that process. Here, it's all individual. It's almost like everybody's in the race to win the gold, but they're willing to train and they're willing to do it properly and not just finish the race at any cost.
Well, animals are a huge part of the farming process. Could you please tell us a little bit more how they play into the Japanese agricultural standards?
Well, this is called the layover time. And I'm going to say it in multiple ways. The layover time is where you allow your soil to regenerate. So when you finish your harvest or your period of time, you let the soil regenerate. And by doing that, you will bring geese and cattle and other animals, and they will basically fertilize the land and then let the land regenerate on its own. The weeds come out, the grass comes out, you till it over. And so nutrition goes back into the soil. At the same time that I say that, it's also a process because these animals that are grazing on the land, they're also eating the crops. And so they're also getting much nutrition. They're also getting much value. And of course, we devour those species. So we do want to have a high quality meat and poultry supply to go to. So it's kind of like a twofold or a threefold equation where the animals are part of the ecosystem themselves. And farm is eventually very, very important. This is lost in the commercial farming. There's no grazing anymore. It's just till, turnover, and then those crops, which again are being fed to humans, are also being fed to the cattle. This is why we're seeing a lot of our animals be diseased. We've got the swine flu. We've got mad cow disease. The list goes on and on and on. This comes from the crops. This comes from what they eat. It's a very simple methodology to understand.
Thanks for explaining the role of animals in farming. That's really quite important as we see it's a whole circle of nature and grazing in the farms. And we do consume those, so it does have an effect. So obviously, not all companies are JAS certified because it's high maintenance compared to mass farming. What are some of the other challenges faced by JAS farmers, Doc?
Well, JS farming is only applicable to Japan, Lei. And so when we look at who is certified in Japan, 99.9% of all commercial farmers in Japan are certified. That's the process. And if you're not certified JAS, then you're not allowed to sell your merchandise on a commercial level. And that is the rule and the law of the land. However, beyond all of that, the certification process is quite stringent. Like I said earlier, you will be inspected, you will be certified, you will be checked. It's an ongoing process. This is something that is not done in other countries. In fact, very little is done in other countries. There's really not much of an inspection process that is done. But moving forward with our company, Koso Med, we have been certified for almost 30 some years. JAS was created, I believe, in 1996. And you might want to check later on. I think it was 1996 that it had started as a regulatory body. So we have been part of that process for almost 3 decades.
Well, that's incredible, but it's only in Japan. But what do you think the future looks like for JAS farming?
Well, I think the JS farming in Japan is going to be even more regulatory and more severe because Japanese consumers and worldwide consumers now are really into JAS products. In my travels around the world right now, I see a lot of products that are exported from Japan. In comparison to other countries that might have USDA or other organic certification, JAS seems to be the leader only because it's certified by the health ministry and not just a subordinate agency. So I see JAS as being a very leading technology for the future. And especially for consumers, they are really becoming more aware of what is non-GMO and what is organic. Maybe years ago, they kind of took it for granted that everything was either organic or non-GMO, but people are looking at it from a very careful and magnification point of view these days. So I see a very bright future for JAS, and I see a really bright future for something that we've already adhered to for the last 30 years. Our products are all JAS certified.
Amazing. Well, so we truly appreciate the efforts of the Japanese agricultural standards. And just my last question in terms of how you kept comparing the largest industrial farming to the small agricultural standards that are organic. In terms of profitability, how do they compete in the marketplace? Because the reason why it exists in America in such a prevalent in the society, like it's everywhere, because it's profitable, and they create a lot more profit than the small organic farmers. And I've been an advocate and an educator for supporting local farmers, because it's not just great for us, it's also great for our environment and for our animals, for the soil quality. And also regenerative agriculture is on the rise here in the States. So if you could speak to how we could all help preserve Japanese agricultural standards, organic farming, and how we can support to make sure that it's as profitable and eventually grows to the same scale as the industrial farming.
It's really a great question, and something that I've been battling for many decades, and that has been to help the farmers. I think it comes down to this: is what the consumer is really willing to pay for a product. A lot of people want things to be very clean, non-GMO, to be organic. The list goes on and on and on. But when it comes to actually paying for it, they want it to be reasonable. And of course, that's normal. However, there are certain costs that are different when you're growing things for quality than you are for quantity. As I mentioned earlier, in the US and other industrial countries, there's a lot of subsidies. So the farmers are not really under the gun, so to speak, to produce products of high quality, because they get paid nevertheless. And that has a lot to do, again, with the consumer's mentality. In Japan, the consumer is quite different. They are really willing to pay more because they understand that they're receiving a better quality product. And I think in the world today, and I'll just come back to this in just a second, that people are beginning to realize that you do get what you pay for. And so cheap is great and all of that is wonderful, but you do have to pay sometimes for higher quality. And the consumer here, especially in Japan, and when you come, Ella, when you come here and you'll see apples that go for $50, and that's not the norm, but they do go for $50, or a watermelon that is sold for $150, or other fruits and vegetables, and people are paying that price for it. It's not necessarily the norm, but it is keeping the industry alive. And I think for our company, we do something that's quite different than most companies. We don't buy the product when it's done. We buy the product before it goes into the ground. So the farmers that work for our company, they are assured and guaranteed payment before the seeds are even put into the ground. It's a little bit different than most companies, and we're very proud of the fact that we can do that for our farmers. But overall, I think for the future of the farming industry, if the consumer really wants to have a higher quality product, they're going to have to kind of look at their budget and maybe spend a little bit more. I don't see any other way. Otherwise, everything that I mentioned earlier is just going to get worse. Because as we drive down the price, and let's say we go to a third world country, to a fourth world country, I don't know what a fourth world country can produce when they can't even get gasoline at their pump. So it's difficult to say, oh, it's cheaper, but I'm going to have a better product, because that is impossible. The technology is not there. So I do believe that the future is bright for the farmers, but it's probably going to be very segregated between, let's say, the American farmer who's into quantity and the Japanese farmer that's into quality. It'll be your choice as a consumer. And I guess that's a good thing too, because that kind of creates a very high level of competition, which again will create a better product. I believe in competition. I believe that you should be able to create better and better products. yes, keep the price down as much as possible. But sometimes it's difficult because you do have to spend more time, money, and energy to create something that is good. That's good. That's to everything in life.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that because that's one of the concerns when here the food is cheap, the industrially subsidized food is cheap. And when we get into the consumer education, that's one of the complaints when people get is like, oh, it's expensive to lead a healthier lifestyle and to eat healthier. And what I've always said, don't look at it as an expense, look at it as an investment. You can try to save on this your whole life, and then you'll end up paying for it later on in life once you get the diagnosis or some sort of health condition. Or you can start investing every day into your well-being, choosing high quality products, and see how that goes. And usually we have a much better health outcomes and overall higher chances of longevity.
Ella, you're absolutely right. Let me just kind of re-emphasize what you just said in another way. A lot of people are not aware that the produce that they buy at the store has a very thin layer of stones and dirts and pesticides and herbicides. They never really accumulate how much they really devour of that particular substance per year. I have done research and I have come to a conclusion that the average person, somewhere between 8 to 15 pounds a year, devours dirts, rocks, gravel. I had a very interesting situation with one of my associates who, again, is very similar to what you're talking about, a person that doesn't want to spend more, had his kidney removed. He spent $500,000 to have it removed. I don't know if it was out of pocket, and I don't know if the insurance covered it, but it's a lot of money. And again, the kidney stones or whatever was, really stuck in that particular part of his body, I would probably say fairly confident that it did come from produce. I mean, because if you are devouring that much dirt a year, your body is not getting rid of that. It's staying in your body and it's affecting other parts. So, people have to judge. I mean, if they're going to spend money on their house and their cars, they should be able to spend money on themselves.
Yeah, before we wrap up, do you want to get into some of the personal experiences? Like you said, you've met some of the farmers, and it's very important that we communicate what those farmers are like and what your experience was like out there in the farms. Because from my experiences, I see this as one of the best way to educate consumer is to really get them onto the farm and to see what their food actually looks like before it gets into the packaging or on the supermarket shelf.
Yeah, it's really a great question and statement. It's one of my favorite events to do. Our company, Koso Med, provides what we call traceability tours. And that's where we bring busloads of our brand partners to our farms and have them spend 2 days with the farmers, sometimes 3 days, go in their home, go into the farms, actually pick up a shovel and try to do the work themselves. I mean, it's all in fun, but the farmers have a way of showing their passion and working with you. It's one of the greatest events that we have. And it gives people an opportunity to see how hard the work really is. I mean, people see the produce in the marketplace. They go, oh, there's my carrot. But trying to get a carrot out of the ground is not a simple process. And if you do it day in and day out, it's backbreaking. And sometimes it's the early parts of the night. So my personal experiences, I've trained over 1,000 farmers firsthand. And you say, well, you're not a farmer. No, I was not a farmer. I became a farmer. And the reason that I became a farmer is because of the education process. In order to create a better product, I had to learn, and they had to learn, how we could work together. Science equals labor equals a better product. And so we kind of worked together over the years. So I got to learn quite a bit firsthand. But the big pleasure, Ella, is when people come out and they try to become farmers for the weekend. It's an incredible sight to see people. By the end of the weekend, they get it. They understand. And so this is something that we promote. And I do believe that something that is really lacking in the world today is traceability. We go to the store and we have no idea. So that kind of sets a lot of what we do apart, is that we actually do show you. And again, when the time comes, Ella, you'll be one of the first ones I hand the shovel to.
Well, that's incredible. Thank you so much for taking the time today to go over the Japanese agricultural standards. I think I definitely got a lot more clarity on that, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate it. But I do want to talk to you next time about the soy protein because that's one of the most nutrient dense components of your specific Kosa super drink, which is my favorite product. And the soy protein is ultra beneficial. And I want you one day to help us understand how that's valuable to our consumers.
Of course, I'll be happy to do that in our next podcast and much, much more. I mean, we have just touched the very edge of all of the technology. A lot of what I'm saying too, Ella, is what I do at the farm when people come out. And I think for most people, when they've, and with your background coming from your area of the world, you realize that backyard farming is quite intriguing.
I would
It's
ask
quite,
you a question like, pesticides, herbicides, chemicals. There's a reason they exist, right? They're
mm,
solving some sort of a problem and concern, right? Whether it's the disease, plant disease that Lay mentioned earlier, or it's some sort of an insect that is preventing the plant to grow. How does Japanese farmers solve that problem without the pesticides?
going back to colonized farming, it's impossible to farm without chemicals. You need a helicopter. It's too vast. And so it's too dense. It's a jungle. So the only way to cure that is you start with the seed. The seed itself is already injected with some kind of chemical, which makes it a super seed. So by the time it gets to its harvest stage, it's already free of certain pests, not all pests. You have to do that in the commercialized world. In a backyard farm or a parcel farm, it's a 24-hour job. You're out there constantly. You're watching your crops. You're watering them. You're brushing them. You're going through areas or patches that seem to be maybe infestated with something. You're cutting them away. It's very easy to do as opposed to those large scale farming operations. That's how organic farming is done. There's no other way to do it. There's no way you can grow organically on a commercial farm that's 1,000 square miles, but you can do that in a backyard farm.
Now that you mentioned the seed itself, could you address the concern of genetic modifications of some of the crops that we see here in America? And more consumers are concerned not only with that they should be choosing organic, but also should be looking after the label that says non-GMO.
Well, GMO or genetically modified organism, and that's a hard word for people to swallow or a hard phrase for people to swallow. Basically, it's a seed that has been altered in a laboratory and it can be injected with a variety of different chemicals to make it stronger. Some of the GMOs can be injected with insects that are resilient to, for example, phantom or maybe certain viruses. And so it is a untested new territory that we have come across in a legal way for the not the farming industry, but for the seed makers to experiment. And so it comes from demand. Going back again to we're growing as a population. And so to feed the population, we have to have bigger potatoes. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. There's a lot of franchise fast food restaurants and they make great French fries. I'm not going to mention them by name, but they make great French fries. As the demand for those French fries grow, so does the resource. And so we go from a potato that maybe is medium sized to a potato that looks almost like a watermelon. That's a GMO. It is untested. When I mean untested, we don't have any long-term data to see how it affects human beings. It is a concern for me personally, but the demand causes that to happen. So as long as the demand is there, we're going to see more and more and more GMO products. Salmon is another species. As the demand for salmon has increased, well, guess what happens? We start altering the salmon. And so we have salmon with tiny little heads and tiny little tails and big bodies. That would be the equivalent of a human being having a tiny little head and tiny little legs. Something has been altered, and of course, we're digesting it. So there it is. You don't have to be a genius to figure that out. Again, all of that will be out in reports probably in the decades to come. We went through a very difficult time with all the different crops around the world. Tobacco was one of them. For years and years and years, everybody said it was safe, it's cool, and all of that. Later on, as the data came out, the statistics came out, we find out that tobacco is not that great. It does cause cancer. So, we're in that stage right now. A lot of what we're doing as scientists around the world is untested, maybe safe by consideration, but untested because there's no data. But it will come out, and GMO is something that is a byproduct of demand.
Thank you, Dr. Z, for communicating this important topic of the quality and realizing that all the Koso Med products that are Japanese agriculture standard approved, they're all GMO free and pesticides free. It says here on the packaging, and it's so important for all of us to understand how Japanese agriculture standards and practices are different from the American ones. I definitely someone who learned to appreciate that over the years, and I hope our listeners will do the same.
I hope so too. This is our policy, our philosophy. I don't think it'll ever change. And I hope that the world also learns from this process. I think it's quite important for the next generation. If we don't stop it now, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And again, all of this is nothing new. It started decades ago, and it's just progressing and progressing and progressing.
Well, I sure did learn a lot from you too, Doc. Thank you for sharing your experiences of JAS farming and experiences of the farmers, of course, in JAS farm. So thank you so much, Dr. Z. And thank you, Ella, for co-hosting and asking really great questions. Thank you for that. Thanks for making this an enlightening episode.
Thank you, Lei, and thank you, Dr. Z. I appreciate your time and your knowledge very much.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to having you in Japan. Seeing is believing, but tasting is even better. And when you taste our onions at our farm, I mean, it's just an incredible, incredible sensation. There's so much I'm ready to share with you. Really, there really is a lot. Well, thank you.
Great. We look forward to that. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and we hope, just like us, we hope that you learned something new and valuable about JAS farming in Japan.
Next episode is going to be from the farm.
We'll see you there. Until next time, stay curious and stay connected.